Hey and welcome back to Fanfic Reading. Today we are reading The Warmth That Changed It All by Raalm and ToxicExotic. I hope you enjoy.
Chapter 63, Time Alone. The sound of music filled Yang's ear as she did her morning exercises, the heat of Mistral causing sweat to bead on her forehead. A yellow sports bra and black shorts were the only things that covered her body, but that definitely wasn't because of the heat. Instead, it was for a very specific reason. And as that reason walked through the door, a wide grin spread across her face at the sudden stop of footsteps. Looking to her side, she saw Weiss stood in the doorway to the bedroom, her white nightgown falling down to mid-thigh and her hair loose as she watched her with arms crossed. Seeing the smile of the heiress face as she bit her lips, Yang chuckled inwardly and continued her push-up, very aware that Weiss was still watching her intently. "Show off," Weiss breathed, still not moving. "No idea what you're talking about," Yang replied, feigning innocence. "Just a morning workout." "MHM." She didn't sound convinced. "And the outfit? It's hot." She watched her girlfriend finally move to sit on a chair that directly faced her. Even though she knew she had Weiss' undivided attention, she acted as if nothing was out of the ordinary and continued her push-ups. For almost a good 3 minutes, she felt the woman's eyes roam her body, trailing from her arms to her legs, and did her best to suppress her laughter, though it did make her arms shake a little. "How long do you usually take?" Glancing up, she saw Weiss leaning forward and gave her a smile. "Usually about 30 minutes. She grinned mischievously. "But if you're enjoying the show, I could go all day." The thoughtful hum that came from the woman sent a shiver down her back. "All day? Maybe. I'm pretty strong, you know. Is that right?" Yang gave a nod, suppressing the smirk that tried to etch itself on her face. "Then keep going." Weiss stood from her chair and made her way back to the bedroom. "I'll know if you stop." Yang knew Weiss was clearly planning something, and since she didn't want to potentially lose whatever that was, she decided to obey the command, though she did slow her pace a little. As she waited for the heiress to return, she thought back on the day before. It had started off pretty miserably. Wanting to get away from Vale to clear her head, she'd taken an early flight and booked herself into a cheap hotel for the night. When she'd awoken, however, she found her head anything but clear. She was still reeling from the fight with Blake, as what her best friend had revealed, and spent a lot of that morning just wandering around Mistral. But after finally talking to Weiss, after the heiress put her worries about it causing problems for them to rest, she found herself able to think a little clearer. That didn't mean she wasn't still a little annoyed, since Blake had probably chosen the worst timing possible, but she had calmed down about it. After talking it through with Weiss, they'd made their way to probably the nicest hotel she'd ever seen. While the suite that Weiss had paid for was nowhere near as nice as the apartment back in Vale, it was extremely spacious with 3 rooms and 2 bathrooms. Another few hours had been spent talking about things after that, but eventually Weiss had left for another meeting, and hadn't returned until almost 10 at night. Given how the day had started, Yang hadn't been in the mood for anything more than sleep, and Weiss had obviously been exhausted too, so they had simply retired to bed for the night. However, when Yang woke up, her arms wrapped around her gorgeous girlfriend, she found the stresses of the previous days had washed away. Sure, the annoyance was still there just below the surface, but that could wait, since she wanted to just enjoy the week with Weiss. "All right," a voice said from the door, a little too far to the side for her to see without stopping her workout. "Let's put your strength to the test then, shall we?" Footsteps grew closer, and bare feet came to a stop in front of her. Stopping long enough to let her eyes roam up the long legs, Yang saw that Weiss was wearing the same white shirt she had been in when she tried to surprise her the day Ruby had come over. It hadn't been seen since. Feeling a wide grin pull at her face, a scroll was placed in front of her, a timer already loaded up. 7 buttons. Though Yang couldn't see the woman's face, she could definitely tell there was a small grin on it. 1 remove for each press up. Think you can do that? Only Sev. She was cut off as the legs moved away, and a large amount of weight was pressed gently onto her upper back. A small groan escaped her as Weiss got herself situated, but she was soon sat cross-legged. "Still easy?" "UP." Yang grunted, getting used to the weight. "Light as a Fia." "They're good," Weiss said, her voice teasing. "Get all 7 and make it to a minute, and I may just find myself with an extra 30 minutes before I head out for my meeting. Bet. Yang laughed, watching Weiss' hand come down to hover over the start button. The moment it was pressed, she began the first push-up. Since it was a lot more weight on her back than she'd ever had at the gym, she found the first and second push-ups to be rather easy, but after that, they began to get hard. Halfway through her fourth, her arms started to ache, but she persisted nonetheless. She was very aware of her limits, and 7 was definitely not that. By the sixth, though, Weiss' hand had already snaked their way under her, the fingers grazing gently over her stomach, and sent sparks shooting through her. She felt her arms start to shake and barely finished it. Just one more, babe. The seductive voice, and the knowledge of what one more would get her, she pushed though and managed the 7th one. However, she knew she wouldn't be able to do an 8th. Do any, she breathed heavily, feeling the weight quickly vanish. Face down on the rug, she couldn't see the timer before it was picked up, but there was an intake of air from her girlfriend. Only 47 seconds. A small groan escaped Yang as she let her arms rest for a minute, but with the weight gone, she found them much more responsive. Pushing herself up to her knees, she was met by Weiss standing directly in front of her. The woman stooped down with a wide grin on her face, and Yang felt herself pulled into a swift kiss. But you did get all 7, so claim your prize if you want it. Flashing a cheeky grin at the snow-haired woman, Yang ran her hands up the back of the smooth legs, and was quickly reminded of something Weiss had done on their first night together. Remembering how it had been done, she let her fingers drift to the back of the heiress' knees and pressed in with enough force for them to buckle, sending the Schnee to her knees in front of her with a loud laugh. No time was wasted as Yang caught the woman's lips with her own, one hand landing on her thighs, while the other made quick work of the buttons. In no time at all, the front of the shirt was thrown open, and Yang felt a pair of arms slung around the back of her neck. You really love seeing me hot and sweaty, huh? Yang teased as she pulled away from the kiss. I knew you did it on purpose. What can I say? She chuckled, stealing another short kiss. I love driving you wild. You definitely do that. Raising an eyebrow playfully, Yang placed her hand on Weiss' stomach, her fingers pointed down. A small gasp escaped the heiress. Oh, is that so? Blue eyes gazed into hers, and a slight nod was given. Yang let her hand slip a little lower, her other reaching up to brush one side of the loose shirt aside. Well then, maybe I should take the next 30 minutes to show just how sorry I am. But you only lasted for. Yang cut her off with a kiss. She knew Weiss wouldn't have even offered those 30 minutes if she didn't have them in the first place, and that the challenge was little more than for show. From the way Weiss' fingers were pushing into her hair, she knew Weiss wanted it too. I really shouldn't reward failure. Yang kissed her again, but quickly pulled back to gaze at her lovingly. You really want to waste more time teasing me? Weiss' eyes rolled as she grinned uncontrollably, and Yang knew the game was over. Using the hand on Weiss' shoulder that had pushed the shirt aside, she gently guided the woman onto her back and reignited the kiss. It may not have been how Yang intended the teasing to end, she'd been thinking maybe a little flirting at most, but she was definitely not going to pass on the moment that had presented itself. Yang knew her dad missed Mistral. He'd moved away from it as a kid, but she knew from how he talked that he still remembered it fondly. It never really took much to get him to reminisce about the lush springs that caused flowers to erupt all over the city, filling it with color, life, and beauty. About how the constant smell of delicious food wafted into from the lower levels and permeated the air with all kinds of aromas. And though she'd only visited the city a few times to see her grandparents, who had moved back when Ty graduated before they'd passed away, she couldn't really disagree with her dad's view on it. Especially as she sat on a bench, happily sipping her pumpkin latte and looking out over the fields of Mistral. She would have much preferred to be sharing the view with Weiss though, but she had been warned that the heiress would be spending a lot of time in meetings. So with Weiss having already left for work, Yang had a few hours to spend just killing time alone. So far, she'd visited a few of the restaurants around the city, trying small portions of the various foods that had made their way to Mistral over the years. She'd made certain to avoid any of the stores with no fauna signs in the windows, but most of what she tried had been amazing, and so filled with flavor then she could still taste the lamb kebabs despite her latte having already washed any remnant of the food away. She'd even made a reminder on her scroll to go back and ask which spices were used. When she clicked save on the note, she switched over to the camera, standing up to take a picture of the beautiful golden goldens that stretched out for miles. It took 3 tries to get one that looked perfect, but she finally got it and quickly sent it to her sister with a small message attached. Postcard from the homeland. She felt a little bad about not saying goodbye to Ruby before she'd left. Of course, there had been a small goodbye just before she and their dad had left for Blake's shop, but Yang had intended to actually visit her before going for the airport the next day. Unfortunately, she'd left a lot earlier, and saying goodbye had been the last thing on her mind. Thankfully, though, it only took a few seconds for the message to be read, and only a couple more seconds for the scroll to light up with a call from the girl. "Hey, sis," she said as she picked up. "What are you up to?" "Just taking a break from my volunteer work at the library," Ruby replied, her voice drowned out a little by some noise in the background. "Ilya's here too." Yang heard the small beep that showed she was on loudspeaker. "Hey, Rainbow." Yang tried to keep some kind of normalcy to her tone, since she knew Ilya had likely been informed about what had happened. "Sup, dumbass?" The girl's voice sounded playful, so Yang let out a little smile as another beep told her the loudspeaker had been turned off. "So what are you and Ilya doing?" she asked, trying to keep her voice as inconspicuous as possible. "Just eating. Ilya showed me this great vegetarian place." "You hate veg." "I do not," Ruby said in an offended tone. "I hate gross veg. This is good veg." "Wow, I'll try not to take that too personally." The sound of Ruby's laughter put a smile on Yang's face, and she leaned against the railing. She always loved hearing her sister laugh, especially recently since it meant she wasn't stressing about doing so much volunteer work. "So how's Mistral? Still beautiful?" "MHM," she hummed. "Kinda strange, but kinda feels home-y. If you know what I mean?" "Well, Grandma and Grandpa were from there. I still remember their house. Grandpa's stupid baseball stuff everywhere, and Grandma always shouting at him for leaving it lying around. I miss those visits." "Me too, Rubes. I'll definitely bring you next time. We can visit their old house." "I'd like that." While Ruby exchanged a few words with Ilya, Yang thought back to the few times she'd visited her grandparents. Though the visits hadn't been frequent, she definitely got along with them fairly well. They seemed to understand the burden that had been placed on her, and although her instincts to protect Ruby never really went away, those visits had been some of the few times where she really felt she could relax and let someone else take care of Ruby for a little while. She'd been pretty sad when they passed too, but given their age, the news hadn't really come as a surprise. "I should let you go though," Yang breathed, just happy to know Ruby seemed okay. "Sounds like you're busy." "Hold on." The urgency in Ruby's voice made her stop. "I heard you had a fight with Blake." "Oh." Yang let out a low sigh. "Don't worry about that. We'll be fine. We both just got a little mad is all." "So you're still friends?" "We're still sisters," Yang corrected her. "And sisters argue. But we'll work it out when I get back, okay?" "Good." The relief in Ruby's voice was obvious and sent a small pang of pain through her. She hated making her sister worry like that. "Well, I should go. I only have like 15 minutes left, and Ilya said she knows a place where they make an ice cream sandwich out of cookies." Letting out a small chuckle, both at how excited Ruby seemed and just how hard Ilya seemed to be trying to impress the girl, Yang smiled into the scroll. "Got it. Have fun, sis." "You too. Later." Later. The hang-up tone greeted her ears, and she collapsed the device. Putting it back into her pocket, she leaned against the railing and let out a small groan. Though she certainly didn't hold it against the younger girl, it would be a lie to say Ruby didn't complicate a few things. Due to her difficulties making friends, the girl had always latched on to people Yang was close to instead. That meant arguments often impacted Ruby too, and made her worry that she could potentially lose a friend. She remembered how sad Ruby had been when Arslan moved away, since the girl hung around the house quite often. It often led to many happy moments where the two girls would laugh, or Arslan would offer life advice that helped Ruby in some way or another. So when she'd moved away to attend Haven, Ruby had been very quiet for a few weeks. She always recovered, but Yang knew she didn't take those losses lightly, and tried her best to minimize them where she could. That day had been part of the reason she decided to never introduce a date to Ruby unless she knew it was the real thing. Melanie, Bronze, even Coco when they had dated for a month. Thankfully, while none of those had been serious enough to make the introduction, she had known Weiss was immediately. From the first date, she'd known just how real things with Weiss could be, and by the second, there had been no doubts. She was happy that the meeting had gone well though, and Ruby seemed to like Weiss more than she did Arslan. Not only did they also laugh when they were around each other, but Ruby seemed to look up to Weiss. After all, Ruby had only told her about volunteering at the fondest meetings since Weiss had advised her to. Though that once again brought Yang back to the issue of Ruby being attached. Though Yang was going to be doing everything in her power to make sure Weiss was in her life forever, Raven was right about people growing apart. She had no idea what the future held, what could happen when Jacques found out, what he would do, or what could happen even further in the future if they made it out of the first mess. It was a simple fact that people changed. But even as she stood there and acknowledged that fact, Yang couldn't think of a single way Weiss could change that would make her stop loving the Elysian. In that, she found comfort. There was nothing in the world that could stop her from loving Weiss, and Weiss had made it abundantly clear after yesterday that she felt the same way. So, with her thoughts finally having gathered and her worries abated, she let out a happy breath and looked back up at the beautiful vista before her. She hated that her mind still took some time to process the bad before arriving at the good, but she definitely had to admit that it had been finding the good a lot quicker in the past few months. Finally finished? Yang asked, drawing her eyes away from the television, as a pair of arms wrapped around her shoulders from behind. MHM. Though Weiss had returned to the hotel almost 3 hours ago, Yang still hadn't seen much of her. She'd been locked away in the small study room working on what looked to be a mound of paperwork, so Yang had been doing pretty much anything she could to keep herself occupied, which involved a lot of trash television that she only half understood. What are you watching? No idea. She shrugged, flashing Weiss a smile. From what I can tell with my limited Mistralian, that girl is sleeping with her sister's boyfriend, but her sister is sleeping with her best friend anyway. Really? Well, either that, or the sisters are sleeping together. But I'm pretty sure it's the first one. I hope so. Weiss laughed, removing her hands and walking around the couch. Sorry I took so long. It's fine. She shook her head as Weiss laid down on the couch, her head coming to rest on her lap and gazing up at her. Work comes first. Yang ran her fingers through the strands of platinum hair, her fingers digging into Weiss' scalp to apply gentle pressure and earn a happy groan from the heiress. Watching her girlfriend's eyes close, she gave a soft smile and returned to watching the television. You hungry? She asked. Starving, but my legs are too tired to go out. I suppose we could make do with room service? This is a 5-star hotel, Yang. Their restaurant has 2 Michelin stars. Yang grinned, stretching out to try and snatch up the menu from the nearby table. Then I'm ordering one of everything. I doubt even you would be able to eat one of everything. Careful. She smirked as a warning. You already lost 1 bet today. I wouldn't exactly call that losing. Unable to stop the happy grin that spread over her face, Yang finally caught the menu and flipped it open for them both to see. Looking over it, she saw that Weiss was right in that there were way too many options for her to realistically eat. Her eyes immediately found the steak section though, as well as the strawberry cheesecake. Despite the menu being quite extensive, it only took them a couple of minutes to decide on what to order and send it down to the kitchen. Yang had of course gone for the beef Wellington with garlic potatoes, while Weiss had opted for buttered lobster. However, they had ordered quite a few desserts, such as a chocolate cake, a lemon tart, and a peach mousse. Knowing it would take a while to be brought up, she threw the menu and the phone back onto the table and returned to massaging Weiss' scalp as they both watched the program. Yang was finding she enjoyed the quiet moments more and more. Though moments like the one that had happened that morning were certainly nice, sitting there and just relaxing had a certain feeling to it that just made her feel comfortable. She didn't have to do anything or say anything, there were no expectations. She could just enjoy herself by gently soothing her girlfriend after her long day at work. However, just because she didn't have to say anything, that didn't mean she didn't want to. So how was work? She asked, knowing Weiss appreciated when she at least showed some interest in what she did at the company. Long. The woman groaned. Councilwoman Lakis is being purposely elusive with the actual figures for minimum living wage, and she has a fair few supporters on the council. Not to mention that they are requesting quite a lot of our aid in getting their economy back up and running. Your company has to help with that? We don't have to, but Edward thinks it's a good idea, and I agree. And what does that mean? Like what do you do? The wages play a big part so people can spend more, but mostly just taxes. They'll get more money from us using Mistral to manufacture more stuff that is then exported around the world. That money then goes into the economy. But they are asking for a little too much at the minute. The STC wants to help, but we need to make sure our assets are secure, and Mistral is at a rough spot at the minute, so we can't move anything that's particularly sensitive over here. Ah. Yang sort of understood what Weiss was saying. So what can you move over? Scroll manufacturing. Weiss shrugged. Not entirely, but it's a pretty big market, so it should be helpful. Also a few other things like manufacturing of processors and stuff that goes into our other equipment. The ramp up in production here will also mean more jobs too, so more into the economy from that as well. I have no idea how you stay awake in those meetings. She chuckled, poking her Weiss in the stomach and feeling it squirm a little. But then again, you put up with me, so I know you have a ton of patience. Dealing with you isn't too troublesome. The heiress giggled, her blue eyes lighting up. And it's worthwhile. I'll take your word for it. Though it was said jokingly, she still received a small scowl from the snow-haired girl as a hand reached up and caught her chin. Feeling herself pulled down, she happily accepted the brief kiss that was placed upon her with a smile. When they pulled apart, Yang saw a kind smile had returned to her girlfriend's face. You should stop with that self-deprecation, she said warmly. You're the catch of a lifetime, Yang. Even though that same sentiment had been expressed multiple times in their relationship, it still filled Yang with warmth. She greatly appreciated that Weiss tried to make sure she knew how much she was loved, even when the woman was very aware that what had been said was only in jest. So are you. She grinned down. Feeling her eyes flutter a little as the hand on her chin moved to play with a lock of hair, she leaned down to kiss her again. Enjoying the feeling of love that washed over her, she let it linger for a few extra seconds before breaking it and giving her girlfriend a wide grin. Now! Weiss smirked in return, turning to her side to watch the television. Act as my translator. I need something mindless to unwind. Well, this is definitely that. A laugh rocked the girl in her lap, and Yang leaned back on the couch feeling extremely content. So moving her hand to Weiss' exposed shoulder, she went about messaging the stiff muscles while waiting for the food to arrive, determined to make the mind-numbing story of the program a lot more enjoyable, even if it meant changing the scenes entirely. Chapter 64, A Remnant of the Past. The loud sound of heavy machinery filled Weiss' ears, making her wish she could borrow a pair of earplugs from some of the workers. She'd been up since 5 that morning, and barely managed a morning coffee before having to rush out of the hotel with Yang fast asleep. While she'd known it was going to be nothing but meeting after meeting, she definitely hadn't expected the workload she had received so far. It seemed like after every meeting, whether with the council or the head of some STC plant or office, she always walked away with a mountain of paperwork that kept her stuck at her desk until late into the night. But she'd known her time with Yang would be limited, even so far away from home. That particular afternoon, she found herself walking across the factory floor, following a man with light brown hair. Despite being the factory manager, the man looked like he'd never even touched the machinery. His black suit was crisp, his leather shoes shined enough to reflect the light that flooded the large room. He stood out like a fly on a wedding cake against all the other workers. Though there were a few humans among them, even Weiss could see that an overwhelming amount of the workers were faunus. In comparison to the manager, the other workers' overalls were stained and tattered. Though each of the workers were likely clean, the initial look of them gave the impression that they were not there by choice. Of course, she knew a factory was a place where something getting torn wasn't exactly uncommon. It had been why the uniforms were not exactly made from fancy materials so that they could keep the price low. But, if anything, that helped prove to Weiss just how bad the situation was in Mistral. The uniforms were not only inexpensive to make, but also for them to replace, so the fact that they hadn't showed just how tightly stretched everyone's wallet was. So this expansion you need? The foreman said with a strong accent, his ordinary clothes also making him stand out. When you say it starts? Things will have to be organized beforehand, meetings and such. Weiss replied coolly, seeing a few eyes dart her way. But you should be able to go ahead with the planning stages by the end of the month. There will also be a few more factories that need to be built. Are your men ready for that? Yes, yes. The man said a dry laugh. This is Mistral. We build new factory every day. I joke. He laughed again, but it soon faded into a sigh. But sure feels like it. Had the man not been with the Mistral branch of a company the STC shared a very close partnership with, she wouldn't have been particularly enthused by his less than professional behavior. However, since she knew the company's work was exceptional, she simply gave him a nod. And how long will my facility be shut down for? The manager, Mr. Kapil, asked, his voice barely veiling the annoyance he felt. Don't know. Depends on plans. Kapil let out a frustrated grumble, but didn't argue. In truth, Weiss didn't like the man. He seemed to be very arrogant and full of himself, believing he was above everyone who occupied the same room as him. In a sense, he was very much like Shock, and every word that left his lips annoyed her. Very well, Weiss said with a nod to the foreman. I shall leave you two to assess the area. In the meantime, she turned to the manager. I would like to look at your files and make sure everything is in order. Would there be someone who could show me to your office where I can get some quiet? Of course. He sounded glad to be rid of her more than anything. However, she felt the hair on the back of her neck stick up and shot him a filthy look when he snapped his fingers and whistled as a nearby faunus with a dog tail. You? Show her to. Weiss cut him off and stepped forward. He is not your slave, she said warningly. You will treat every worker here with respect, especially in my presence, or I will find someone who does. Do you understand? For the first time since she had met him that morning, concern actually entered the man's eyes, and he let out a small cough. Forgive me. Rough days and all. She didn't believe his excuse in the slightest. Yes, would you show Mrs. Schnee to my office, please? The faunus gave a polite nod, and held out a hand to signal the direction he was going. With one final glare at the manager, she turned on her heel and made after her guide. On the way, though, she figured a few questions wouldn't hurt. Can I ask, how do you like working here? She said with a polite smile, purposely slowing her gait so that she could hear whatever reply the man gave over the loud machinery. Hey! Yang tried her best to not screw up the Mistralian as she stepped out in front of an attractive boy wearing a plain black uniform. A mess of dark hair hung from his head and partially covered one of his bright yellow eyes. Can you point me to the theater building? This campus has a really weird layout. You get used to it, he replied in Valak. And though his words seemed kind of bland, there was a hint of humor in his tone that said he agreed. Turning around, he pointed to a building in the distance with a big green spire. It's that one right there. Follow the sequoia trees and it'll lead you right there. Though they don't really like being interrupted. I'll be fine. Yang laughed, placing her hands together and giving the boy a small bow as she recognized the beads around his neck as the same ones her grandparents wore. He gave one in return. Thank you. Yang watched the boy walk away and let out a small breath as she took off in the other direction. She was a little nervous and had contemplated whether the visit to Haven was even a good idea for a few days. In the end, she had decided there was nothing bad that could really come out of it. They were still friends after all. But still, it had taken her 3 days to gather the courage. And even as she followed the sequoia trees towards the indicated building, she felt like she was still gathering the final pieces. It wasn't until she walked through the door, however, that she finally took that distinctive final breath that usually came when a decision was set in stone. Hearing voices coming from what looked to be the main stage, she cracked the door open and stuck her head inside. It was quite a large room, filled with too many seats for her to count without putting aside a free afternoon to do so. The main stage was huge and made of a light wood that was maintained impeccably. On it, talking happily amongst themselves, were around 20 students, but only one of them stood out to her. A dark-skinned girl with platinum blonde hair. It had been 2 years since Yang had seen the girl, but even from a distance, she still looked incredible. Wearing a crop top and a pair of loose leggings that stopped just short of her shin, it was clear that the girl had not given up on her boxing either. Thankfully, though, none of them had noticed the intrusion, so Yang quietly slipped into the room and snuck over to one of the many chairs near the top row. Unfortunately, it squeaked as she pulled the seat down, and every head turned to face her as the sound reverberated around the room. "This is a close PRA." The girl that addressed her was quietly silenced as the blonde reached out and put a hand on her shoulder. A visible sigh left her as words that Yang couldn't hear were said. "Fine. You can stay. But be quiet." "No problem," she replied in rough Australian. Keeping herself quiet, she settled in and watched the group go through their rehearsal. 30 minutes later, 25 of which were spent on her scroll with the brightness and sound turned down, the rehearsal finished and the people began to leave the stage from the back. All but one, who pulled on a black uniform blazer and made her way up the stairs. As she drew closer, Yang made out the olive green eyes that were gazing at her curiously. Giving a small wave, she stood up and gave her a warm smile. "Hey," she said with a friendly tone. "Been a while." "It has," Arslan replied slowly, her eyes giving her a once-over. "You look good." "Don't I always?" she grinned. "You definitely haven't let yourself go either." "Could still take you in a fight, though," the girl said with an amused huff. "So what are you doing here?" "Well, I was in town. Figured I would come and say hello." Arslan clearly noticed the inflection, as her brow furrowed, and she deflated a little as she looked away. "Ruby told you?" That surprised Yang. "No. My girlfriend goes to Beacon and told me about the transfer thing. I knew you wouldn't miss out on a chance to travel. Guess I was right. I can't say I wasn't a little hurt." While their relationship was over, Yang still considered Arslan a friend, and thought that particular feeling had been mutual. So when Yang had first heard about the transfer from Weiss, she'd spent the next few days eagerly awaiting a potential visit from Arslan. But it had never come, and she thought she may have been mistaken about the girl taking any opportunity to travel that she could. But with what had practically been an admission, and the look of shame that entered Arslan's eyes for a second, she clearly hadn't been. "I'm sorry," the girl said with a shake of her head. "I wanted to, but then I bumped into Ruby, and she said you had just started up something with someone new, and it seemed pretty serious. So I thought it might be awkward. I thought we were still friends. I didn't mean it like that." Arslan sighed, hefting her bag over her shoulder and finally meeting her eyes. "I know why we broke up, and it was for the best, but I didn't exactly want things to end with us." "Oh." It was Yang's turn to fall silent as she took in what had just been said. She'd known that neither of them wanted to break up at the time, but the long distance had just been too much for her to deal with. She figured Arslan would have gotten over it quite easily, but it looked like she was wrong. It suddenly began to dawn on her that the visit may not have actually been a good idea after all. "Shouldn't I have come here either then?" she asked, feeling a little bad that she may have stirred up painful memories. "You should really stop making such rash assumptions," Arslan said with a firm look. "Because I didn't say that either." Another few seconds of silence passed, but Arslan shook her head and took a small breath. "It's good to see you, Yang." "Really? It's always good to see you." While it wasn't particularly flirty, Yang could sense the sincerity behind those words. She knew Arslan, after all, had spent many afternoons hearing those same words said, and even still they stirred something within her. While it paled in comparison to the feelings she got at the mere sight of Weiss, it was still a fondness that she doubted she would ever lose. "But I do have class in about 15 minutes, so can't really talk for long." "That's fine." Yang shrugged meekly, happy Arslan was willing to talk. "I can walk you to your class at least." "Sure." The girl took off towards the door, shifting her bag on her shoulder and motioning with her head to follow. More than happy to, Yang followed her, gently letting the seat back up so as to not cause any more noise than she already had. "So how are things back in Vale? Blake? Ty? Ruby?" "They're all good. Couple of rough times, but nothing that can't be fixed." "So the usual?" Yang couldn't help but chuckle. Arslan had been there for some pretty intense arguments, after all. "Sort of. A few new things have happened, though. Raven finally came back, and it seems like she's actually staying this time." "That's good at least." "Yeah. Feels good to finally be getting some closure on that." Yang agreed. "So what about you? And Nadir? You both doing good?" "I'm good. Nadir is. Well, Nadir. But now he's going to be a father. What? Yang could barely contain her shock. She remembered Arslan's stepbrother fondly, but it was hard to deny that he often ended up in rather unfortunate situations. He also tended to be a little flaky, trying new things for only a short amount of time, before giving up the second they went wrong, but he was also a really kind guy who had always been pretty nice to her. That was mine and my parents' reaction too. Arslan laughed, the sound bringing back yet more fond memories. But credit to him, he's actually stepping up this time. He's got a job, his grades are up, and while they aren't together, he's doing everything he can for the mother. Huh? Well, good for him. What about you, though? How's Haven been? Honestly? The woman pushed open the door, and they both walked out into the blazing sun. It's pretty amazing. They have a good boxing program, but the theater scene is way beyond what I imagined. Street performances, random shows, full-blown theater appearances. Pretty much everything is just normal here. Well, sounds to me like you made the right decision. Yang smiled at her ex, happy to see Arslan was happy with the path she'd chosen to take. Thankfully, Arslan gave her one back. It wasn't an easy one, the other blonde said solemnly. So what are you doing in Mistral anyway? Just a small vacation. Oh, alone or with Ruby and Ty? Actually, Yang hesitated. The woman had just admitted that their breakup had not been easy, but she also didn't want to lie to her friend. I'm here with my girlfriend. The slight flicker of Arslan's eyes towards her was unmistakable, but they seemed to hold some acceptance. That didn't surprise Yang at all, since it had been Arslan who had taught her about accepting her emotions and working through them little by little, instead of just letting them consume her. So is this the same girl Ruby mentioned? Yang gave a small nod. I guess you two really are pretty serious then? Probably an understatement at this point. Yang laughed gently as they walked beside what looked to be a small, shallow pool. Oh, really? Arslan replied with a smile. Do I happen to know this girl? You said she attends Beacon, right? I met quite a few people while I was there. Well, that's kind of the complicated part. Yang scratched her head and gave a small chuckle as Arslan's brow shot up in curiosity. They were coming out soon anyway, and Yang didn't want to be telling half-truths. You probably know her better from the news than from Beacon. Yang watched the cogs turn behind her ex's eyes. It was no longer a secret that Weiss was now in Mistral, as the press had picked up on it the morning before, so her clues were not exactly subtle. And knowing just how smart Arslan was, it didn't surprise her that she saw realization spark behind the olive green hue. It quickly turned to disbelief. You can't mean Weiss-Schnee? Yang scratched her head again, giving a nervous chuckle. With it being all but confirmation, the woman's eyebrow shot up again in intrigue. How in the world did that happen? She, came into Blake's shop one day, and we kinda just hit it off. Yang said, realized just how mundane the start to their amazing relationship had been. And she knows about your past? Yep, she replied with a smile. Don't get me wrong, things haven't been easy, but she knows all about it, and we're coming out about us soon too, so you know. Huh? Arslan hummed, slowing her pace a little as they approached a building with a large gong on the top of it. Never would have guessed you of all people would end up with a Schnee. Is Blake okay with it? They're actually friends. Though it helps that Weiss is nothing like her dad. She's even been inspiring Ruby to actually try and get into Beacon. Well, it certainly seems like she makes you happy. Arslan smiled and sat down on a bench just outside the building. And you seem a lot more confident in yourself, and definitely calmer. Hey! I was always calm. Yang laughed. You were about as calm as puppies shown treats. Yang bumped their shoulders together. I remember the time you punched a guy so hard that you broke his tooth, just because he touched your hair. Well, Shay was a dick. Yang chuckled. You weren't exactly much better, Miss Accepts Any Challenger. Hey, I won every fight people asked for. Even Carden's. A wide grin pulled at Arslan's lips, and she shook her head. But I guess you're right. Pride was always my biggest downfall. They even gave me a nickname here because of it. The Golden Lion. Sounds pretty fitting to me. And pretty sexy too. It was Yang's turn to be elbowed that time, and she let out a small laugh as she rubbed her ribs. They were old memories, but still filled her with a warmth as she remembered Arslan constantly hopping in the ring to fight a new challenger. She remembered how the woman had looked so alive in those moments, so beautiful in how she fought and smiled at the same time while people cheered her on. Almost like being the center of attention was what she was born to be. But in all seriousness, Yang, Arslan finally said when the laughter died down, you seem genuinely happy. The kind of happy I wished you were with me. I was happy with you too. Yang tried to counter, but received a small glance in return. I know, Arslan said with a nod. Just not this kind of happy. Yeah, Yang admitted. Maybe not this kind of happy, but I definitely wouldn't be where I am without you. You're the one who broke down my walls. You helped me move on from Blake, helped me handle my anger, and taught me to think more rationally, and you might not know it, but that helped in a tough moment. It literally saved my life. Looking to her side, she saw Arslan looking down at her knees. Taking a small breath, she leaned in and pressed her lips softly against the brown skin of the lion's cheek. Again, familiar memories came rushing back to her, but she soon pulled away. As she did, Arslan turned to her and blinked slowly. Thank you, Yang whispered, trying to express just how much he meant those words. For everything you did for me. It took the girl a couple of seconds, but the smile quickly appeared on her face again. Standing up, she stretched her arms out and let out a loud sigh. Well, she said when she finally dropped her arms, you are definitely worth it, Yang. And you definitely deserve to be happy. Yang stood up too and returned the grin. So do you. And I'm sure you'll find that person one day, and they'll be lucky you did. Pulling the woman into a hug, Yang enjoyed the still familiar feel of the woman pressed against her. Again, she remembered the countless nights they had spent in each other's embrace, laughing and playing. Arslan might not have been her first love, but she'd been the first to return it. And Yang knew that so many good things had happened in her life because she had. She would always remember those things, and there would always be a part of her that loved Arslan for them. But all things came to an end. Their end had probably come too soon, but it had nonetheless. But that too had led to some amazing things. Things that she knew she should be getting back to. So, with a sad sigh, she finally peeled her hand from around her ex and took a step back. I guess you should be headed to class, though. I should. Arslan coughed, hitching her bag back over her shoulder. It really was good to see you again. You too, Yang replied. Just don't be a stranger next time you're in Vale, okay? The woman gave a small nod. So long as you call first the next time you come to Mistral. It would be great to spar with you again. See how good you become. Let you know I'm coming to kick your ass? Got it. They both shared another smile, but before long, Arslan raised a hand to wave goodbye and used the other to pull the door to the building open. Even still, even with it being over 2 years since their breakup and having found Weiss, it still hurt to see the woman leave behind another door. But nevertheless, she returned the farewell. And then the door shut, finally closing off a chapter of Yang's life that had been left unfinished for so long. So, after taking a brief moment to collect herself, Yang let out another sigh and put her hands in her pockets, walking away from that old happy chapter towards a new happy one. Weiss! A voice shouted from the entryway. You back? In here, she answered, scrawling out a quick amendment to her proposition. Less than a minute later, Yang landed beside her on the couch and let out a low groan. She looked a little drained, but she was smiling. A quick kiss was placed against her cheek. The woman shifted in place, and a hand found her waist. More than happy to oblique to the gentle requests for movement, she picked up her notepad and shuffled back to rest between Yang's legs. How was work? Busy, as usual, Weiss breathed, scratching out what she just wrote and trying again. Another boring interview with a journalist for some magazine. Also thinking I may have to do a little investigating into the factories and how the workers are treated before I leave. Saw some things I didn't like today. Well, I'm sure you'll figure it out. A kiss was placed on the back of her head, and Yang's chin came to rest on her shoulder. Feeling the gentle breaths in her ear, she let a happy smile take over her face and nuzzled deeper into the blonde. Warmth radiated up her back, and the hands wrapped around her stomach were gently tickling her, though in a pleasant way. Thanks, she replied. How did it go with Arslan? Good. Yang replied simply. It was good to see her again. Did it give you the answer to my question? Glancing to her side, she saw a little confusion enter her girlfriend's eyes. Did you love her? The confusion was quickly replaced by realization, and she fell silent to think. It was a question Weiss had asked the first time Yang had ever told her about Arslan, and at the time, the blonde had been unsure how to answer. When she'd been asked that morning about whether she was okay with Yang going to see her, she didn't even hesitate before replying yes. Not just because she didn't want to stop the woman she loved from going to see someone she cared about, but also because she hoped Yang would finally get the answer to that question. Besides, there was a single doubt in her mind that Yang would come back to her at the end of the day. She'd been a little jealous of Blake and Arslan before, but that was before she was certain their relationship was the real deal. I did, Yang replied quietly, the finality in her tone making it clear she was being honest. But not as much as I love you. Shifting in place, Weiss raised a hand and placed it gently on her girlfriend's cheek. For a brief moment, she planted a loving kiss on the woman, closing her eyes and enjoying that Yang leaned into it without any hesitation. Finally, though, she pulled back and gave her a warm smile. I know. I love you too. After receiving a grin in return, Weiss turned back to her work and relaxed back into her girlfriend's warmth. She was happy that Yang finally had her answer. Chapter 65. Ridding the Stain. Weiss let out a small yawn as she woke, more than happy to feel a warm body laying beside her. Rolling over on her side, she slung an arm over the woman's bare stomach and smiled contentedly. The night before had been amazing in its simplicity. They'd ordered from a place Yang had found during her exploration, and the man at the reception desk had given them a weird look when she went down to collect it. But the simple lamb kebabs were so much better than she had thought they would be. They even rivaled the hotel's food, which was at least 10 times more expensive. Yang had watched television while Weiss continued to work on proposals for the council and solutions to issues she was noticing around the workplaces in Mistral. Fortunately, though the work usually carried her till a little later than intended, she still managed to finish in time to spend an hour watching the garbage comedy that Yang had on, and enjoyed the seemingly random stories Yang made up with her attempts at translation. And then, when all of it had finished, they'd done the same thing they had done pretty much every night they had been in Mistral, retired to the bed, where Yang made her world explode with pleasure. It was very much a simple night, but they were Weiss' favorites. It wasn't just because she was spending time with the woman she loved, but also because there was a normalcy to them that she was still getting used to. With her money and job, she knew they would be traveling the world. They would be visiting every kingdom, dining at every major restaurant, and staying at every 5-star hotel. They would be attending events and balls and galas, all the things people dreamed of when being rich. But nobody seemed to understand how hollow all of those things felt after a while. For Weiss, the idea of spending a night in with Yang, of watching the television while cuddling up to the beautiful blonde, was 1,000 times better because it made her feel normal. It showed her she didn't need the money or the business, that just having Yang and a couch was enough to make her happy. With the memory still fresh in her mind, she gazed across at the beautiful sleeping woman beside her. It had been increasingly common for her to wake up first due to meetings and work, but she was quite happy that that was the case. It meant she could freely stare at the blonde as she laid on her back without some witty comeback being thrown at her for doing so. The way the blonde's lips were slightly parted, or the way her wild mane of golden hair was spread out across the pillow, and the gentle rise and fall of her chest, they were perfect to her. So perfect, in fact, that she felt her smile widen into a grin and gently shuffled in a little closer. Arriving at the woman's side, feeling her blazing hot skin press against her own, Weiss pressed a kiss against Yang's shoulder. She didn't stir. Trying again, Weiss leaned in a little closer and pressed her lips against a higher spot. Again, she didn't stir. Weiss didn't mind, it just meant she could try again after all. This time she lifted herself up a little, grazing her lips against the scar just above her breasts before trailing her kisses further upwards. She only made it halfway up the boxer's neck before she felt a telltale breath that informed Weiss the girl was finally awake. "Morning," she mumbled, placing another kiss into Yang's delectable flesh. However, even though Weiss knew the woman was awake, she received no reply. It wasn't too unusual for Yang to play little games, to try and entice her into a little more attention. But that was all fine, because Weiss was more than happy to give it. So feeling her grin turn wicked, Weiss pushed herself up a little more and sunk her teeth into the soft skin of her girlfriend. The faint groan she received in return spurred her on a little more, and she allowed her fingers to trace to the outline of Yang's abs, which she could help but notice were becoming more and more pronounced in recent weeks. "You really like waking me up like this, huh?" Yang finally asked as Weiss gently bit down on her earlobe, her voice still groggy from having just woken up. "MHM," she hummed, letting her hand roam around the slightly defined six-pack that she loved so much. "It's fun." "Well, I definitely won't complain." The woman stretched, her arms reaching out and giving Weiss view of her amazing body before she was pulled into a tight hug. "I'm surprised you're hanging around ST still, though." She stifled a yawn. "You usually jump out of the bed straight away." "That's because I usually have work all day." Weiss smiled at her, reaching up for a kiss. There was a little morning breath, but nothing she wasn't used to already. "But I only have one meeting today." That definitely seemed to get Yang's attention. And for good reason. While it was supposed to be a vacation for them both, Weiss had been so caught up in work that she hadn't actually been able to do anything but the simple nights in. She knew Yang didn't really care, that the woman was completely fine with work coming first, but she really did want to spend more time together. "And when is that?" "In a bit." Weiss lifted her head from Yang's cheek a little to check the clock, and saw it was almost 9. 2 hours. It's only a short one though, so we can meet around 2. And then I have you to myself all day?" Weiss gave a nod. "I don't think I've had a better morning in a while." Chuckling at the happy tone in her girlfriend's voice, and nuzzled in closer. She could smell the slightest hint of sweat coming from her, but it was far from unpleasant, merely acting as a pleasant reminder of the night before. "Anything you want to do?" I could use something fun to wear, maybe get some stuff for some restaurant interviews." Yang paused, and Weiss waited, looking up at her expectantly. "I was thinking." The blonde shuffled a bit, an arm peeling away from the cuddle to rummage on the bedside table for a second before coming back with a notepad. "I might get this done before we head back." Weiss reached out and took the notepad, carefully inspecting the heart of fire. The final design was actually rather nice, the dark orange and thin black outline accenting each other nicely. As she looked at it, she let her hand find the thing it was supposed to cover, and gently traced them. In truth, the mark didn't really bother her anymore, but she knew it was something the blonde wanted rid of. "It still looks amazing," she said honestly. "Yeah. When it's done, the outline of the old one will still be a little visible, but it'll look like it's getting burned up." "Like you're burning the past?" "MHM. A part of my past I don't like." "You know." Weiss handed the notepad back and gazed up into the pair of lovely lilac eyes. "All this tattoo shows is how much you will do for Blake, right?" "To you and Blake, maybe," Yang replied softly. "All it means to me is that I let her fall in so deep in the first place." Falling silent, Weiss allowed her hand to leave the scar and rested it between the woman's breasts, gently tickling her neck. Though she didn't agree, she knew Yang still felt guilty about allowing Blake to get so deep into the white fan, that she still blamed herself for allowing everything with Adam to continue so long. She suspected that past inaction was also why Yang had freaked out so much about Blake rejoining. "Then we'll get rid of it today." She smiled up understandingly, happy to see one returned. "And we'll get you some clothes for interviews. I know just the place." "Sounds good to me." Yang dropped the notepad back onto the table. "But before all that, I really want some breakfast." "You know," Weiss grinned wickedly, "that is my least favorite of your nicknames for me." The blonde's eyes widened a little, but she quickly recovered and let out a soft chuckle. "That wasn't what I meant." She smiled, slipping further under the quilt. "But who am I to decline such an offer?" Giggling to herself as Yang's hand found her waist and pushed her onto her back, Weiss brought the sheet up to her mouth and bit down. Just like their nighttime activities, the morning ones were also becoming increasingly frequent. Weiss didn't know if it was because they were on vacation and had the privacy of a hotel, or because she knew their relationship would no longer be hidden in a few days, but she'd found herself in the mood more often than ever before. The slightest kiss was sending her mind spinning, and the casual exploration of Yang's hands would cause her body to react instantly. It definitely wasn't surprising that she felt her stomach twist in anticipation from the slow kisses that were trailing their way down her body. So, more than happy to let Yang start the day off with a bang, or a yawn as the blonde would say, Weiss let herself melt into the woman's affection. Checking her watch as she stepped out of the hotel, Weiss let out a small sigh of disappointment. The meeting had continued longer than she'd suspected, and a whole hour of time with Yang had been wasted, not to mention another 20 with dodging reporters. Thankfully, though, with the wig and her glasses in place, she wouldn't have to worry about any reporters holding her up any longer. As she walked down the street towards their meeting place, she couldn't help but glance in the windows of the stores she passed and smile. She knew how much Yang would like her outfit, a white sundress that dipped in the back. The fabric itself only fell to mid-thigh, but a length of clear lace fell just over her knees. She'd had it years ago specifically for her when she was last in Mistral, and was glad to finally have another reason to wear it. Weiss still remembered how Yang had remarked on how much she liked her legs, something Weiss couldn't blame her for, and how she herself had teased the woman with ideas of skirts and sundresses. And since it was summer in Mistral, it was teasing she was finally going to put into action. Thankfully, Yang wasn't too far from the hotel. It was only 10 minutes later that Weiss stepped out of the elevator and saw a small little cafe. The blonde sat in one of the chairs, slowly sipping what looked to be a hot chocolate and looking out over a lake that lay west of the mountain. Since they'd met in the autumn, Weiss had never really seen the blonde during summer. It was a natural fit for the woman though, as each strand of golden hair seemed to catch the sun and glow with just as much intensity. Just like the smile that was thrown her way when Yang saw her approach. "Sorry for taking so long," she apologized, leaning down to give her the boxer a hello kiss. Wachet was being a pain at the office. "It's fine," Yang replied with a tone of happiness in her voice as she scanned her up and down. "It was definitely worth it for this." "No idea what you were talking about." Weiss gave an innocent shrug before adjusting her glasses and crossing her legs as she sat down. "MMHM, sure you don't." The woman gazed at the exposed flesh with zero shame, and Weiss had to stop herself from chuckling. "So what did you do while I was at work?" "Ah, you know. Just wandered around aimlessly because a part of me was somewhere else." "So the usual?" "Uh-huh." Yang smirked, pushing the drink over to her. "Nah, went to see my grandparents' old house. Met the couple living there now too. They let me look around a bit. That was nice of them. I bet it brought back a lot of memories." "Yup. There's still a dent where me and Grandpa slid down the stairs one time." Weiss smiled at the goofy grin on her girlfriend's face as she clearly relived the memory. "It was fun. So how was work? What did Wachet do this time?" "She's been insisting that she can only find half the employee files that I actually need." She sighed, taking a small sip of the drink. "There's most likely a reason for that, but I will get to the bottom of it before we go. You'll kick her ass in no time." "I know," Weiss replied, passing the drink back over and standing up. Very aware that Yang's eyes were following her, Weiss gave a small twirl as she walked towards the sturdy balcony, suppressing a wide grin as she did. When she arrived, she leaned against it and bent over slightly, knowing it would pull the hem up and give a little more of a show. Just as expected, it took barely a few seconds for Yang to join her, the strong hand slipping around her waist as a kiss was pressed into her neck. "Still don't like the wig," she muttered, causing Weiss to roll her eyes. "But everything else is pretty fucking good." "Such foul language." Weiss laughed, reaching back to pull Yang closer. "Remind me to wash your mouth out later." "Was that an attempt at dirty talk?" Yang cackled happily, the sound making Weiss grin despite the blush creeping up her face. "Because it was her." "Shut up," she giggled in return. When the giggles finally subsided, Weiss let out a cheerful breath. With the warmth of the afternoon sun on her front, and the even more comforting warmth of Yang pressed against her back, she figured anyone would find it hard not to be satisfied. It was made all the better by the fact she knew it would be normal in less than a week. There would be no hiding, no sneaking around, no pretending like she didn't want to just kiss the girl for no reason whatsoever in the middle of the streets. No, in less than a week, she would be free to show just how much she loved Yang without need to pause. "So where is this place you want to take me for clothes?" Yang asked softly, slipping out of the hug and leaning back against the study railing. "Because my tattoo appointment is in 90 minutes, and I doubt they want me trying on clothes with a brand new tattoo that's leaking blood and ink. I highly doubt it would be the first time." She grinned in return. Considering who she was taking Yang to, she doubted blood would be a problem. "But you're right. We should head there now." Pushing herself off the railing, she turned and took Yang's hand. Together, they both took off towards the elevator, stepping inside and feeling a small lurch as it took off. The elevators of Mistral were actually rather unique, even compared to Atlas standards. Since it was built around a small mountain, it could be a real pain to get to places. As such, the people of Mistral had adapted. Unlike elevators in other cities, the ones in Mistral traveled not only up and down, but sideways too. Through deep grooves carved into the mountain and replaced with complex technology, a single elevator could travel all the way up and around the mountain, dropping the person off at any drop-off point they desired. In exchange for the mobility though, they tended to be a little slower so that it didn't stress the system too much. Thankfully, the store she had in mind wasn't too far from the cafe, located only one level down from the peak, and happened to be right next to another drop-off point, so it only took them a couple of minutes to arrive. "I know this place," Yang said when they finally approached the front of Chloris Finery. "Coco never shuts up about it." "Well, now you get to make her jealous by owning something from here." With a small chuckle at the smug smile that overcame Yang's face, Weiss pulled the blonde forward into the store. The moment they walked through the door, the smell of spices and paint vanished, replaced by clean fabric and a soft smell of lime. Though it was the world's most renowned fashion boutique, there weren't many clothes on the shelves. In fact, there were only 5 racks in which shirts and dresses hung. However, Weiss knew that the selection was only so limited because a vast majority of their trade was made specifically for each client. Behind the counter, working on a sewing machine, was a woman who looked to be in her mid-40s, her light brown hair falling just past her shoulder. Walking up to her, Weiss saw the woman's face break into a smile as she stood. "My favorite customer," she said merrily in a heavy accent, though her valet was perfect. Weiss gave a raised eyebrow, only to receive a sly grin from the woman. "I know each and every Chloris piece that leaves this shop, even if it's one my daughter made. I should have known you would recognize it, Pennant." Weiss smiled kindly. "Reese did amazingly on this one." MHM. The woman hummed proudly. "It's one of her best. I was so happy when I saw it finished. Was always worried too many crashes on that blasted board of hers might have ruined her fingers." Weiss was perfectly happy to convince herself that the reply that entered her mind was entirely because of Yang's influence, but it was a reply she would definitely never speak out loud. Instead, she gave a smile and twirled on the spot, knowing the woman was trying to get a look at how well it had helped up. After a satisfied hum was heard, Weiss stopped her slow rotation. "Just as good as the day she made it. Worn 4 times. 5. Even better." The woman smiled happily. "So what can I do for you today?" "Ah, yes." Weiss moved aside, motioning to Yang, who had remained silent during the introductions. "This is my girlfriend Yang." Weiss didn't think she would be able to describe how good that felt. "She is in need of some clothes for potential interviews." "It doesn't need to be anything fancy," Yang replied meekly with a small wave. "Nonsense, you have come to the right place," said the older woman. "With something from us, any employer would be CRA." A loud bang from the back room cut her off, and they all turned to the open door to look at what had happened. Laying on the ground, her neon green hair spread out around her, was Reese Chloris, Pennant's daughter and Weiss' sort of ex-girlfriend. While it had never been a serious relationship, more something that was for fun while she and Winter were in Mistral last, she liked the girl well enough to not regret their time together. Nevertheless, when Reese's eyes connected with her, a wide grin spread across her face, and she performed a kickflip to get to her feet. As opposed to her mother, who was wearing a beautiful mahogany-colored dress, Reese was wearing what she almost always wore: a loose purple hoodie with a pink sweater underneath, and a pair of black shorts. While the girl was amazing when it came to fashion, she rarely went beyond anything simple for herself. "Nice wig," she chortled, disappearing for a second before rolling out on a green and black skateboard. "Doesn't match my dress though. It's either this or a sea of reporter breathing on your store window." "Ugh. Those distasteful fools," Pennant replied, smacking Reese's arm with a small length of fabric, causing the girl to hop off the board and kick it up. "Good for advertising, nothing else. But enough of those pests." She turned to Yang with a clap. "Let me look at you." "So you two know each other?" Yang asked curiously as Reese's mom walked around her humming to herself. "We had a sordid weekend together," Reese said shamelessly, her mother shaking her head and muttering something about the girl being too much like her father. You can thank me for all the fun parts, she added with a wink. Oh, so you're Weiss Mistral X? Sounds like I left an impression. That's your takeaway from every first meeting, Reese. Weiss laughed, sitting down in the chair to wait for Pennant to finish. So how are Butai and Coop? Just like the women of the family, the men were also pretty well known in the fashion industry. Reese and Pennant handled the woman who came into the store, while Butai and Coop handled the men. However, Coop had a much more adventurous nature than his wife. An adventurous nature that had been passed on to their children too. While Reese had found a love of skating early, Butai had been deeply invested in hiking the last time she had visited. Not bad, Reese replied, pulling a tape measure from her oversized pocket and measuring Yang's waist. Busy with a few orders for the summer solstice festival. Let me guess, shirt and pants kinda girl? She asked Yang. For work, yeah. Reese hummed, looking Yang up and down. I'm thinking a yellow shirt. Creamy, not vibrant. Let that hair of hers shine. Lengthen it a little at the bottom so she can keep a... Her hand reached out towards Yang's breasts, cupping the air around them, but not actually touching. Keep growing into it. And the trousers? Plain black should be fine. Standard for interviews and fits her nicely. Good choice, Pennant said with a smile. That sound okay for you, Yang? You two are the professionals. The blonde chuckled. Good. The older woman smiled. Reese, you take the measurements. I will go and see if we have the fabric for it. I may have to order in the material for the shirt, though. Miss Nuxia's dress was a hassle. Kay! Watching the woman disappear into the back, Weiss stood up and moved to stand next to her girlfriend. Giving her a smile as Reese went about adeptly measuring her legs, she gave the other girl a warning look, receiving a smirk in return. Weiss knew well just how shameless the skater was. Well, that was a thing. Yang chuckled a little over an hour later, both of them waving back to Reese as they exited the store. She's certainly shameless? Open? A little too willing to divulge private details? I was going to say energetic, but those work too. The boxer grinned. She seems cool though. Definitely your type. That's what Winter said. Weiss laughed, taking her girlfriend's hand and directing them back to the elevator. What was that piece of paper you gave her anyway? Arslan's contact information, she replied with a nonchalant shrug. They're perfect for each other. Stepping into the elevator, she watched Yang press a few buttons and gave her a skeptical look. The buttons she'd pressed were for the lower levels of Mistral, and she had just assumed, since money wasn't an option, that the woman would have picked a more well-known tattoo place. After all, it was Mistral, a place of artistic expression in all forms. Clearly, though, the confusion had not gone unnoticed. Can't exactly stroll into a well-known place and have them remove a white fan tattoo, Yang explained. Most places wouldn't even touch it. Oh, that makes sense, she conceded. You have checked they are up to the job though, right? Yup, the girl said with ease, leaning back against the only metal wall of the box. It's where Raven got hers done. Best tattoo place in Lower Mistral, and they welcome faunus too, which is always rare here. Well, if you trust it. Weiss smiled, falling back against the wall too and pressing up against her. A content silence fell upon them as they slowly descended down the mountain. Though Weiss had been down there multiple times, especially in the last few days, to visit the factories, she'd never actually visited the shopping district for the lower levels. It wasn't that she thought the stores there were beneath her, but simply that she'd never really had reason to visit them. However, she couldn't help but be a little trepidatious since she knew the black market also operated from the lower levels. Thankfully, though, they didn't end up going too far down. Mitral had 30 levels in total, and as they made their way down to the 11th, Weiss watched the architecture change. By floor 18, the elaborate roofs and spires were gone, replaced with simple, brown tiles. By floor 15, though, even the colors started to fade. Rare were the greens, and yellows, and blues, simple brown and white taking their place. And by floor 13, those colors were gone altogether. Finally, though, at level 11, the elevator pulled into a landing bay, and the doors opened. As they stepped out into a bustling market, she couldn't help but notice the difference. Instead of neat stores that were partially embedded into the mountain, Small pop-up stands littered a large plateau, their banners and signs painted with varying different symbols. She didn't see any that looked like a tattoo place though. This way, Yang said, leading Weiss down a row of stands towards a small alleyway that was dug into the mountain. It isn't too far. Alongside the elevators, there were also thin tunnels that led through the mountain. They were under constant inspection to make sure that they were safe, but it wasn't unusual for some to have stores in them, though they were usually obscure stores that sold random objects or specialties. Are you sure this is the right place? She asked. I think. Yang stopped and looked around the entrance to the tunnel. Yup. See there? Yang pointed to a spider symbol that was carved into the entrance to the tunnel. Raven said to look for that, so guess we're in the right place. Well then, Weiss took the blonde's hand. Are you ready to move on from your past? Yang gazed down at her, her lilac eyes filled with confidence. And start a life with you? Without a doubt. She rolled her eyes, but knew there was a smile painted on her face. Hearing a laugh from her girlfriend, she was pulled into the tunnel. It didn't take long to arrive at the parlor, since it wasn't too far in, and when they walked inside, Weiss was actually a little shocked, though immediately chastised herself for being so. There had been no reason to expect the place to be dirty or unsanitary, so it should not have been her first thought. In fact, the place was actually rather clean and well maintained. Hi, Yang replied, walking up to the counter, where a man with a spider web tattoo on his neck eyed them both up and down. Appointment at 5? His eyes flicked to the computer. Yang? Fireheart? Yup. He's just finishing up the design transfer, he said, looking back at the again. His eyes squinted a little as he looked at Yang. You look familiar. Oh. The blonde was a little taken aback. You probably knew my M. Raven. Weiss heard the correction and looked at her, but said nothing. Aw. You're Raven's kid? Tough woman. Was the only person I trusted getting my supplies for me. Until she went and wailed on that cop. How's she doing? Good. Yang replied with a smile. Apparently satisfied with the answer, he poked his head through a curtain beside the counter and shouted something in what sounded a lot like Mistralian, though probably the lower Mistralian variant. It was hard to tell when Mistral had so many different versions of its language. He was only a second though, and he quickly withdrew his head again. You can go through. He'll only be MO. Thanks. Walking through the curtain, they were greeted by a black chair that could be lowered back. A small stool sat beside it, and a table with a needle gun and multiple ink pots. To the left, sat at a light board sketching Yang's design was another man, this one with a lot more tattoos, though he too had a spider web on his arm. Take your top off and take a seat, he said, not even looking back at them. I'll be done in a sec. Doing as instructed, Weiss watched her girlfriend peel the tank top over her head to reveal a yellow bra. Holding out a hand, she happily took the t-shirt as the woman took her seat. With a hand on her hip, she admired the blonde. Yang, having noticed, leaned back on the slightly tilted chair and bent a leg, biting her lip as she gave her a look that sent shivers through her body. Knowing it would be the last time she saw it, Weiss walked up to her and leaned down to press a kiss on the brawler's lips, her hand moving to cup the 3 claw marks. Thank you for this, Weiss said gratefully. Even though Yang was doing it for herself too, she also knew a part of the reason was so that she didn't have to look at it either. It's worth it, she said without a hint of regret, before her lips turned into a mischievous smirk. Maybe you should get one too while we're here? I'm sure they probably have some small snowflakes that could go up your arm or something. She replied in false thought, already knowing the answer to that. Though she didn't mind tattoos, she definitely didn't intend to get one herself. I think I will let you be the inked one. Suit yourself. The girl gave a shrug, and Weiss leaned in for another kiss. Though it sent a surge of want through her, just as they all seemed to recently, it only lasted a second due to the tattoo artist stepping away from the light board. A moment later, he was sitting next to Yang getting everything lined up. All right, he said, once Yang had confirmed everything and the outline was placed. You good to go? Receiving one last look from Yang, Weiss gave her a smile. Go ahead, she said. Sitting down on the stool at the light table, She watched the man lower the chair back and raise it so that he was level with Yang's stomach. When he was finally happy, he picked up the tattoo gun. A loud buzzing filled the room, and Weiss watched quietly as the man slowly went about removing Yang's past. A past that she couldn't help but be glad was gone, even if she had grown to accept it.
And that's all for today. Thanks for coming by and hanging out. I hope to see you next time.